Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson, and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. In this video, I'm going to walk you through some suggestions around how to navigate dysfunctional family dynamics, particularly in a relationship dynamic. This could be with in-laws or your own parents, and how that can form challenges or problems in your romantic relationship or in your marriage. So I'm going to talk you through some of the ways in which I work with couples and also with individuals when it comes to this challenge, and how I consider it using different lenses and modalities. Core to my thinking around this is bone family therapy in terms of a strategy or an overarching modality when working with individuals and couples. And then also Gottman theory when it comes to communication and understanding the different dynamics in a relationship. There's also IFS therapies, internal family systems theory. I would say those three main modalities or approaches are usually what I'm thinking about when I'm helping individuals and couples. And so for you, you might be asking, well, what kind of ways do these approaches help in terms of understanding the dynamic with a dysfunctional parent or an in-law? Often what can occur in a relationship, if we take a Gottman's approach, is that the couple are going to have different love languages and different ways of approaching both the relationship, just generally being two different people. They also have our core emotions, what Gottman would say. So this is anger, sadness, fear, loneliness, pride. And these core emotions are formed usually very young, when we're very young. So we emulate a lot of times what our parents did growing up in terms of, whether they got along and how they worked and how they approached these different emotions. And so when a couple argues, or what Gottman talks about as gridlock, there can be the notion that they're turning away from each other versus turning towards each other. Then start engaging in the four horsemen. Typically it starts with criticism and defense. And then there's also the other four horsemen in terms of stonewalling or showing disdain. These different ways to understand the relationship can help just in terms of understanding the way in which I approach the couple. So this is usually the framework that I'm using, and there's more to Gottman's theory. But if we just think about, there's a notion of a gridlock, there's a notion that the couple, to be successful, or to having ways in which they're mending their discord or their conflict, then they obviously need to address usually some of the core issues when it comes to their emotions and how they're responding to themselves, but also to their partner. First, it's having awareness of themselves in terms of their emotions and how from a young age this emotion was shaped, usually by their family dynamic. But then it's also understanding their partner in terms of how they show up when it comes to these emotions. Sometimes people come from their own homes, and there can be the notion of complex childhood trauma, and usually that individual really needs to be doing their own individual work when it comes to addressing any unaddressed trauma that they might have from their childhood, or it could be from these core emotions. And so that's usually the framework, right? Is that Gottman theory gets you to think about the notion that there can be gridlock, and it's about turning towards each other and showing acts of kindness and acts of love towards each other. But then there's these core emotions that we have, and usually when a couple is arguing, sometimes these core emotions are coming up. This is where I start to apply family systems theory and using bone family therapy as well as IFS. In the couples I'm working with, perhaps the mother-in-law with regards to the son in the relationship, or it could be on the wife's side in terms of their parents. But at times there can be what's Bowen would call a lack of differentiation in the family. This could be both with a sibling, so maybe a sibling left home, or there's a lot of drama. It's really about having a healthy differentiation. Usually it's about navigating that relationship with someone who could be considered more toxic. People talk about, maybe my mom is a narcissist or emotionally immature, but usually there's not typically a diagnosis. And I had an interview with Sam Vatkin, and he talks about the notion that narcissism can have an explanatory factor to it, in the sense that it allows you to understand reality and human behavior and psychology.
Narcissism is also helpful as an organizing and hermeneutic principle. Narcissism allows us to make sense of the world. When we try to understand a certain politician, if we apply to him the etiquette of narcissist, suddenly his actions and behaviors make sense. When we try to understand why we have been betrayed by our best friend, if we apply to him the label of narcissism, it has meaning, direction, goal, make sense of the world, make sense of specific industries, like the entertainment industry, politics, and so on, make sense of people around us. Sometimes narcissism helps us to make sense of ourselves. So we call it a hermeneutic principle. It's a principle that makes sense of the world.
There's also the notion that narcissistic type,
narcissistic style, studies show that the narcissistic style is increasing in our civilization, especially among young people. It's because narcissistic style pays. It's a positive adaptation. If you're narcissistic style, you end up being president of the United States. So it's likely that you have met quite a few people with narcissistic style. If you're young, even more. It's very unlikely that you met a narcissist in your entire life, by the way.
And those people might have characteristics that are considered narcissistic. But he's very cautious about over-labeling people, and generally it's not constructive to label in-laws or your parents narcissistic necessarily, but perhaps he would encourage at least to consider that it could have good explanatory factor in terms of understanding the behavior and the way in which your parent or your in-laws are acting towards you. But I think generally you don't want to go necessarily the path, unless that person's really toxic and perhaps they've been diagnosed or they see a psychiatrist or therapist, then perhaps those people can be diagnosed. But I'm just going to assume that you don't have this diagnosis and you don't ultimately know. But it's either the person does have full-blown personality disorder in terms of borderline narcissism, histrionic, or even psychopathic. That could definitely be the case, but it's also just to know that, okay, my parent or my in-laws are acting this way, and over time, if you're confident that that's the way they are and you've done your work and reading, then you can conclude that's the way your in-law or parent is. If you come to the realization or the radical acceptance that this is the way that your parents are or your in-laws are, then it's about the couple navigating this relationship. Having some of the understanding and the principles in Bowen family therapy can be very helpful. Often I encourage and suggest to watch Jerry Wise, as he is a good way of understanding the family and the notion of system anxiety and pinging.
What happens when we are enmeshed, our emotional processes go like that, and they overlap. Now I ping them, they ping me, I ping them, they ping me. And that's how the control continues in our relationship with them. And we also have this attachment to the family super self. Not the real self me, but I take on the family super self. And I believe, think, and feel the way I grew up and what I learned. Living in our heads is a part of that emotional enmeshment. They want to live in our heads.
A lot of advice out there is also to manage expectations and to set boundaries, meaning limiting contact with your family. I have a client and they recommend sometimes it's up to an hour that they can maybe handle their sister. Over time, if it's more than an hour, they find themselves reverting back to that child part of themselves or that role self. They can maintain an hour without getting pinged or having their anxiety or their emotional regulation getting kind of off kilter or off, getting dysregulated, where your anxiety is getting going. And I think people, obviously express that differently. But I think it's understanding how you get triggered by family members, doing your best to remain calm, and easier said than done. But the more I think you have this radical acceptance the more that you're coming from your authentic self and you're setting boundaries and you're coming from that more adult part of yourself versus a child part of yourself. And that's where I usually typically will go into with clients about IFS therapy. In IFS therapy, there's a notion that we have these different parts of the self. And I won't really go too much in depth about it, but if you're around family, it could be the notion, right, that these different parts of yourself are getting triggered. If you're around someone that's truly toxic, and this kind of goes back to the notion from Sam Vatkin's work of interjects and snapshotting. So families can interject, they have an interject of you and a snapshot of you from a younger age, and then they interact with that idealistic image of you. If you're with a person who's narcissistic, there's not really a self there. They also have no boundaries, right? So they're not going to see you as a person, and you're really just there for supply. That's what the really unfortunate and sad part of often these situations are, is that especially with you're thinking about the younger part of yourself, maybe you're still desiring that relationship with your mother or father, but not receiving that. If you've grieved your childhood and that role, that, you know, that idealistic image you might have had of your parents, then you're more on your journey to accepting that this is the way they are. It's not that you tolerate their behavior, but you're more realistic with the fact that they are human beings and have their flaws. And it's just going back to the notion that you could be interacting with someone's interject, reverting you back to a younger part of yourself. And so in the interview I had with Sam Vatkin, he talks about how typically when you're around these individuals, because of that lack of boundary, that lack of self, the notion of the false self and the narcissistic supply, and the notion of shared fantasy, these are all concepts in his lexicon and his way of framing it. If you understand those elements, it's typically in a family dynamic in terms of the lack of differentiation, the family system or the narcissistic family system, in terms of needing you to kind of basically go along with the party line or the way in which the family or the super self of the family operates. And so typically often it's obviously the parents who are expecting you to play usually a certain role, and or you have to be following kind of their lead in terms of how they want things to be perceived on the outside world. And obviously there's different nuances in terms of different family dynamics, but generally that's typically what's occurring in these dysfunctional family dynamics. I did an interview with Keith Witt, and he makes a distinction between having both a dominant hierarchy in a family and a growth hierarchy. You can think about that in your own family or in your family of origin, especially in the past in terms of baby boomers or even earlier generations. It could be the case that definitely, let's say for evolutionary biological reasons, that dominant hierarchies were more the conditioning occurring in a family dynamic. But in Keith Witt's work, Dr. Keith Witt, he talks about the notion of in a family you want to ideally have more of a growth hierarchy. That is the family honoring the growth of the child and really encouraging development. A lot of my clients who've been on this journey in terms of interacting with their family and maybe sometimes going no contact or very much limiting contact, is that they've had to really accept that there's no growth hierarchy in the relationship.
What happens in a system is that when you have somebody who has a chronic problem, the system adjusts around that and becomes codependent. And that causes a lot of problems. And systems in general, going into family therapy, 5.5 million years ago, we came down out of the trees, developed a pair bond because a woman needed a guy around who would sacrifice his life for her and her kids. Those families created the ancestral tribes. And those families created hierarchies. The husband and the wife are the mates, and then the kids. These hierarchies were two different kinds. Growth hierarchies or dominator hierarchies. Growth hierarchies are hierarchies that are fair. They support everybody's development. And dominator hierarchies where somebody dominates with a symptom or with power. To this day, every human institution in every family has some combination of growth hierarchies or dominator hierarchies.
People might leave their family or limit contact because they were noticing that their development or just their happiness or their growth as an individual was very much being hindered by their family. And even though they might have attempted many times to have a healthy dynamic with them, they would continually find themselves maybe dysregulated or just being disrespected or their boundaries being crossed. And so for their own personal well-being, mental, emotional health, they've had to set those boundaries. Obviously, the key to healthy differentiation is honoring your authentic self and what you know to be true. I have a course that walks people through these different aspects of bone, family therapy, IFS therapy, as well as Sam Vatkin's work, also Lindsay Gibson's work in terms of emotional maturity. I provide those perspectives using what's considered 4 quadrants, an integral theory approach, using different worldviews or different modalities and psychosocial as well as system approaches. You're able to understand your childhood much better and your family of origin issues, and it allows you to navigate it using different modalities and approaches. And so I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested in that course. But yeah, that just went live, so definitely check it out. Final thing I want to say is when I'm working with couples, I'm framing it typically within Gottman theory. And he has great advice in terms of understanding the couple, marriage, and love. I would encourage you to have some understanding of Gottman. If there is complex childhood trauma and these different parts could be coming out during arguments or generally in a relationship, then having some understanding of these different parts of the self, and then also how you're navigating or approaching the anxiety within your family. And some of it comes down to healthy boundaries and coming from your adult self and your authentic self, putting priority on your relationship as a couple and making sure that you're on the same team. Because often I think what can happen, obviously if you're in a dysfunctional family or with unhealthy parents, they are going to likely to blur the boundaries. This also goes back to Sam Vatkin's work that perhaps you have a mother or a father who he talks about the fact that they don't really necessarily intentionally gaslight or manipulate, although there's a lot of literature online and on different platforms suggesting that a narcissist is intentional behind their manipulations and gaslighting, and there can also be a motive of evil behind it. But according to some, it's more global in terms of who the narcissist is. They don't have a fully formed self. And he talks about the false self as being a deity.
Narcissists don't do boundaries, first and foremost with themselves, the symbiotic phase. Even when a narcissist develops a full-fledged relationship, for example, with an intimate partner, the narcissist, exactly like the borderline and the codependent, would try to merge and fuse with the intimate partner. The reasoning is different. The narcissist would do that in order to control the intimate partner. The borderline would do that to avoid abandonment. The codependent would do that to feel safe. Each one has different reasons. But they all do this. And this merger, this fusion with a narcissist is crucial because narcissists don't have a clue about boundaries, not theirs and not other people's.
It's kind of delusional, right? So to them, it's like an AI operating. So there is no coder or God. They are still making choices and should be held responsible.
It is not that narcissists like fantasy, daydreaming, or even membership in a cult-like political movement. Oh, that's not the same. Because all these people, even psychopaths, maintain reality testing. They're able to tell the difference between reality and fantasy. The narcissist is not able to make this distinction. And in this sense, pathological narcissism is a form of delusional disorder involving even psychotic elements.
I guess that's just something to think about. I think you can easily get caught up in keeping the narcissist accountable, and definitely a lot of people have been there in terms of having a lot of anger and resentment towards your parents, or it could be in-laws, or perhaps even a sibling. But ultimately, if you come from that radical acceptance and know that they likely lack insight or self-reflection, then you're really just going to accept what is, and you just usually it's meaning that you don't necessarily go there in terms of trying to keep them accountable. That's just understanding this dynamic of how your parents or your in-laws are having influence. And it's key that the couple really are on the same page with this. I've found in some of my work with couples that it could be mother-in-law that's really having a lot of influence on the relationship, and it could be either the wife or the husband feeling thrown under the bus, or that there's allegiances to both the parents and also to them, and so they don't, perhaps there's trust issues, right? Because So it's very complex in some sense, but the need is that the couple are on the same page. Let's say it's the husband's parents, then the husband really has to ensure that he puts his family, his marriage first, then his kids, and does his best to have a healthy differentiation. And there's many tools and aspects of that, but it's navigating that relationship with his parents and setting limits and boundaries. Easier said than done, but often sometimes my clients, like let's say a husband might have intellectual understanding of their parents and maybe know that their mom or dad has issues or mental health issues, but then at the same time they could be still operating sometimes from this earlier part of themselves, this child part, and subconsciously still being influenced by the parents. Typically that takes you going to therapy, couples therapy, or your own individual work to really understand what part is operating. Keith Witt is really understanding who is driving the bus. He talks about how it could be this fearful aspect or this anxious part, or it could be your awareness and your authentic self driving the bus.
Okay, you got a bus with everybody that you've ever been on it. And the question is, who's driving? If it's my macho, screw everybody, or if it's my, oh no, I'm really scared part, or if it's my infant, I can't do anything, or if it's I can't be wrong, or if it's my wise self, we want that compassionate witness to be driving the bus. And so if that happens, everybody behind is a cacophony. You're also a choral director, trying to get everybody to sing together in tune. It's our job to do that. If there's some part of us that just chronically sings out of tune because it's just always feels angry or unhappy or sad or anxious, our job is to go get connected with that and help that part feel secure and loved and find their spot and support them in their spot.
The more that we can self-reflect and slow down often, the better, and understand that we want to come from our authentic selves and our witnessing selves versus coming from this fearful or anxious self. I hope you like this video. I just went through a general overview of when I'm working with couples, particularly when there's a level of dysfunction from the in-laws or from your parents. Hopefully this video helped you think about it from using a Gottman lens in terms of gridlock and the Four Horsemen and communication, and then also understanding IFS therapy, so understanding different parts of the self and how those can be triggered or be operating, particularly as it applies to the core emotions as we mentioned within Gottman theory. And then finally I talked about bone family therapy, the notion of differentiation, and on the notion that a family that's toxic can really be pushing your boundaries and not respecting them. So it's about honoring your relationship, your marriage, and putting that first, and doing your best to stay calm when interacting with your family and not allowing the system anxiety or the super self to really be you being reactive to that, but you having a bit more of that gap in your thinking. So I'm thinking about the book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, he talks about having the gap between your reaction and your impulse. When you make that choice in that moment when you're faced with the system anxiety, that it could be maybe your mom's like calling you and wants something immediately, your child self's coming out, you're reactive and your anxiety gets going, which then perhaps pings your wife or could ping your child. And so, but by having that gap, you're responding more from your adult self and you're staying calmer. Again, easier said than done. So that might mean, okay, I'm going to spend an hour with my mom or my dad here. And then once I figure this issue out, I'm going to leave. You're honoring your limits and knowing how typically these, from a systems perspective, how the family usually operates. And then doing your best to stay calm, coming from your adult self and your authentic self. It takes definitely a lot of art and science. Generally, that's how to have a healthier differentiation by your calmness and your ability to stay anchored in yourself is where you're really influencing the best way you can the family system and your own family as you move forward in your journey.